We got Jody Cooley, local attorney here, who knows a little bit about the 9th District. And so Dave and Josh, take it away.
Okay. Thank you, Kim, and thank you all for coming tonight. And hopefully we can provide some information for you that will help you vote for a Democrat in the primary. I certainly hope so, and I hope again in the general election. I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad to help moderate this forum. Mr. Cooper, thank you for coming, and Mr. McCall, thank you both for coming. I want to start by thanking them for offering themselves to this process. The 9th District is a big district. It runs from Hart in the southeast to Fannin in the northwest, and from Forsyth County in the southwest up to Rabun in the northeast. It's a big county. It's a great district, and we're lucky to live here. It's a beautiful district, and these two candidates have offered themselves to the district. So first of all, thank you for doing, both of you, for doing that. Let's go ahead and give them a hand for being willing to do this. So our format has been established previously, but I'll tell you a little about it. There's going to be a series of questions that will be addressed to the two candidates. They will open with a 4-minute introduction, and then we will ask a series of questions. Now, they have been provided in general the topics from which the questions will come, and the questions have been intended to give you information such that you'll be an educated voter at the time of the election. So with no further ado, I want to say one thing. We have a timekeeper here, gentlemen, and my only job for the night is to try to enforce the time limits. That's for your benefit and for the benefit of the process and for our attendees. So there will be a 4-minute introduction, and then the questions will follow, and we'll try to alternate who goes first, because I know I've learned it's sometimes better to go second than first in these things. So we'll alternate that. Okay, so we'll get started with opening statements. Mr. McCall.
Good evening, everybody. It's great to see all of you here tonight. When I look out at this crowd, at so many people gathered in goodwill and hope for the future, I see the same thing that I see when I look at my students every day. I know that America's best days are ahead of us, and I believe that we can get there if we work together. And I'll tell you where I learned that value from. Right here in the 9th District, where I was born, in Demorest. My earliest memories are of my mama carrying me out of our trailer, our first home that I lived in up until I was 5 years old, walking me out and taking me to childcare so that she could work swing shift at Milliken Humphrey plant on Currahee Mountain. She worked swing shifts so she couldn't train herself to be comfortable to sleep at night or during the day, but she did that not for herself, but for me and for my brothers. I come from the 9th District, and I've learned here from these people, from my teachers, from my colleagues, from the bosses who will be pulling that lever in May and November, what it's like to work with people who are different from you. And I've learned that the promise ahead of us is so great. My father learned about that promise back when John F. Kennedy funded an Appalachian initiative, which taught my father how to be a machinist. And that was a trade that he used for the rest of his life that he really appreciated. This young man growing up in the middle of Martin, Georgia, who learned an honorable trade. And he drove because I had bad teeth when I was very young. My mother took a drug while she had me, an antibiotic that they didn't know was bad for teeth. And not that kind of drug. But she didn't know that that was bad for the teeth. So I had bad teeth growing up, and my father drove 100 miles to Marietta and 100 miles back home every day so that we could have good health insurance. And he got my teeth fixed. So if there's any goodness in me, any compassion or any mercy, any love of my neighbors, I learned it from my parents. Because I want every person in this district to have access to health care, to dental care, because of what my father did for me. I think we can do for one another. My life, the tapestry of my fate, was woven right here in the 9th District. My household is the story of America. My parents working hard to provide a better home for my future. And my wife, whose parents came here as refugees from Vietnam. They came here with nothing. And today, their daughter, born in Toccoa, just a few miles from where I grew up, owns her own business on Green Street, right down the road. I teach Sunday school class right across the road at First Baptist every Sunday. And my wife's family who came here, the salt of the earth, everything that we already know about immigrants. If you want to be successful in life, think like an immigrant. Do like my wife's parents. Work hard, save your money, care about one another, and be a community. That's where I learned goodness, and that's where I learned the American spirit. And here in the 9th District, the promise of the future, that's where I believe we can learn it, is from one another. I think that we can find common ground with everybody. Many of the people that I love deeply voted for Trump this past election. And I know that it is my responsibility. I know them. I love them just as much now as I did before. And you know, when you go to change somebody's mind, you have to go to where they are. You have to speak to them where they are. And I know just where that is because I grew up here. Thank you for your attention tonight. Thank you for your passion. I look forward to working with you for a better future for America.
Thank you, Mr. McCall. One thing I did not say is I want to explain both for the candidates that probably know and also our attendees, we have a timekeeper that is using green, yellow, and red cards. The green card indicates there's 30 seconds left in the candidate's time. The yellow indicates 15 seconds, and the red indicates a stop. Now, the rules that I will ask the candidates to follow is when the stop card comes up, finish the sentence you're on, and find a way to finish that sentence, and all will work out well. So I'm sorry I didn't say that earlier, but that's the way we go. Mr. Cooper?
Thank you. Actually, I was leaning towards hoping he would say, finish the paragraph, or the page, or the book that you were working on. That would be great. First of all, just let me take like 2 seconds to just enjoy you. This is a room of Democrats. Thank you so much for everything you've done over the years to keep Democratic values alive in the Georgia 9th, in your cities, your towns, and all of that. It is an amazing thing to see. My name is Dave Cooper, and I'm a retired soldier. I'm also the founder of a humanitarian nonprofit organization. I have over 20 years as a public servant in a small city, 2 urban counties, a consortium of the 13 western states involved in commercializing solar, wind, geothermal, biomass. I have spent my own money to test and improve energy efficiency in the home that I built. I also built and designed another home that was a passive solar home, which was my residence. I have gone out of my state, flown or driven out of my state for 11 races in 8 states over the last 14 years as a Democrat to help try to elect Democrats to the U.S. government, to the senior-most positions, senator and president. So I've done that, and then on my own personal side, as I said, I worked for the consortium, and then I finished my degree, or I finished my work in the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the hazardous waste cleanup program of that. And so I have, over the course of my life, I have managed staff, I have led project teams, I have written federal regulations, I have written policy papers, and I actually facilitated the largest public meeting that US EPA ever had, at least in the Superfund cleanup program, 1,000 angry and afraid people. So, your task tonight is to look at 2 tasks, really, that have to be done. One is to defeat Doug Collins and Donald Trump in the Georgia 9th District, which is 80%, by registration at least, 80% Republican. And then that person has to write and pass legislation that works for all of Americans. Well, I understand this because I have done the traveling that I've done. I have been in every state. I have worked or volunteered in a dozen states. So I've been unemployed. I have worked for minimum wage. I've cleaned the classrooms and the toilets next to the classrooms. I've even sold flowers on the street corner. Hopefully not everybody saw me the last time I talked about myself, and you don't already know that. But that having been said, this is the task in front of you to decide who best can defeat the Republicans. And I think I have the skills, the experience, and the plan to defeat them. Now, as for my issues, the things that concern me, the things that I want to work on, they're basically in 3 groups. The first is defend democracy, save democracy. And that would include changing how we do our elections, clean elections, 30 seconds, clean elections, stopping fake news, and things like that. We also want to save the things that we hold dear, so the social safety net. And finally, I want to work on things for the future, which would be universal health care. Those are some of the many things that concern me. So it's going to, I was waiting for stop to come up. I was going to run it right to the end of the sentence, and then scene.
There you go.
Thank you very much.
Let's give both of them a hand for obeying those time rules. We like that. Thank you both. The first question will go to Mr. Cooper, and then Mr. McCall will respond to the same question. If you need me to repeat the question, just say, Jody, what did you ask me? I know you can have brain freeze sometimes. But the first question deals with the topic of immigration. It's a very important topic to many of the families in the 9th District, many American citizens and their families, and also to many businesses in the 9th District. The question is this: what do you feel is the proper resolution to the DACA situation, and do you believe there should be any modifications to current immigration policy? Mr. Cooper.
I want to thank the moderator for throwing the first softball in this discussion. In my view, the Dreamers need to stay here and be citizens immediately, without question. They have lived here, in most cases, their entire lives. And to send them to what is essentially for them a foreign country would be cruel and unusual punishment by almost any standard. So that's the first thing. As for broader immigration issues, which I think was your question, broader immigration issues, to begin with, I would say that we need to make sure that we do nothing to the people right now who are essentially law-abiding citizens, even though they are not formally citizens. We need to have our rules reflect, our laws reflect, that these people have come here in many cases poor and desperate, and they've been exploited, and we need to look at that and say, well, if these people have been exploited, do we really want to send them away? Or do we want to treat them in a more humane manner? Now, that doesn't mean that I think that we should encourage people to come here illegally, and I certainly don't think that we should use ICE to be dragging people from their homes, the homes that they've lived in for however long they've been. I think we should put a stop to this movement to deport people completely, except if they are criminals, until we resolve the broader issues. Thank you.
Mr. McCall.
Thank you. Well, I break bread with immigrants on a very regular basis, actually as often as I can, because Jennifer's mom is a really first-rate cook. And I know that their presence in America is not a threat to me, that it doesn't take from my life or my abundance, but actually, I believe the goodness of America is just like the loaves and the fishes. The goodness of America is not diminished when it is shared. But just like the miracle of the loaves and fishes, it is just as abundant as our need and as plentiful as our willingness to work together. Jennifer's parents came here with nothing, and they built a life, and they added goodness to this country. And every immigrant that I've had the honor to teach, and to be friends with is the same way. So we should expand DACA. Right now, it doesn't go far enough. People who were brought here after 2010 should still not be punished by what their parents did. We need to make sure that if people are brought here as minors, they get to stay here as full citizens. We need to also make sure that people have a 5-year path to citizenship, where if you're paying taxes, just like what we fought our revolution for, taxation without representation, people should not be slaving away in these chicken plants, making money for somebody who's much wealthier than them, and not have a chance to vote for their own political destiny. That is fundamentally unjust. And then finally, for those who are already here illegally, conservative estimate is 11 million. As Dave said, they are all citizens in all but paperwork. And to acknowledge with conservatives as a compromise that they did do something against the law, let them pay a reasonable fine, and then put them on the same path to citizenship that the others have. Of course, once assuming that they're not violent criminals. That's my stance on immigration.
Thank you. The next question is first to Mr. McCall, and it deals with the topic of infrastructure. Do you believe there are current infrastructure needs in the 9th District, and how should those needs be addressed?
Thank you very much. I acknowledge the obvious fact, the same thing that our engineers have told us. We are $2 trillion behind in this country on infrastructure spending, and over the next 20 years, that will cost us $4 trillion for inefficiency and for repairs. And so there's no doubt that we need a new deal for the 21st century, a new Green Deal, so that we have local, sustainable jobs that bring energy back home, that gets us out of these endless wars in the Middle East, so that we have local jobs that are both robot-proof and Republican-proof, jobs sustaining our energy right here at home where our neighbors can work in. We do not have enough choices for these young people who are graduating high school. We don't have enough people that we are inviting into an honorable trade, just like my father learned, because there's not enough work out there for them to do. We need to go further than that. We need to make sure that every person in this country has a chance at a job. We reached full employment in this country in the middle of a Great Depression. And right now, there are far too many Americans working and slaving away for someone who's much wealthier than them for just scraps. So this infrastructure is a great opportunity for the American future. We can work on high-speed rails, cut down on carbon emissions in these heavy traffic corridors. We can invest in wind turbines and solar panels, two of the fastest growing industries in this country. There is no choice between infrastructure spending and employment. In fact, they go hand in hand. And our best years, the economic miracle of this country came when the biggest corporations paid their fair share and we reinvested that into the future. That's what we need to do right now.
Mr. Cooper?
Thank you. You know, there are times when going second is great because you can respond to what the first person has said and disagree, seriously. This is not one of those times. Everything that Josh has said is absolutely and fundamentally true, both about the character of America and what we have done to build from nothing to what we've become, all of it. The only thing, and it's unimportant, is I heard it was going to be only $1 trillion to do the whole job, and Josh is saying $2 trillion. But what I want to add that's different than that is infrastructure is always about money. Should be about money and jobs, but it's always about money. And setting aside the more esoteric parts of the infrastructure discussion, which would be high-speed rail and the internet, but going to the basic things that most people think about when they're talking infrastructure, it's roads and bridges and tunnels and things like that. So that gets paid for by the trust fund, the Highway Trust Fund. The Highway Trust Fund has had the same tax on gas for 3 decades. If you can think back to what you were personally making 3 decades ago, for those of us lucky to have been in the workforce 3 decades ago, you can see that there's simply not enough money to do what needs to be done. Now, Donald Trump has said, I've got this great $1 trillion plan. By the way, I'm not going to spend any of my own money or any federal money. It's like $200 billion or something. So what we really need is we need to find the sources of funding for one, and two, we need to write into the process that the jobs that are created are either temporary but long-term temporary or actually permanent jobs, even when they're construction. So it needs to be local hiring, local training. The money needs to stay in the communities. It shouldn't be Bechtel. I have the remainder of the sentence, right? It shouldn't be Bechtel in Wyoming or wherever Bechtel is headquartered. It shouldn't be them making all the money. And thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper.
Oh, I guess I'll be going next anyway, right?
The next question goes to Mr. Cooper, and I'm gonna start reading these questions twice so you can hear them. And not that you didn't answer the question, but it's just maybe easier for you. It's on climate change. And the question is this, it's another two-part question, which is why I'll read it twice.
Okay.
To what extent do you believe human action is contributing to climate change, and how do you believe the United States should address climate change? The question is, to what extent do you believe human action is contributing to climate change, and how do you believe the United States should address climate change? Mr. Cooper.
Thank you. As a person who worked for US EPA for 20 years, if I blow this question, don't vote for me. Okay. The easy part of this is, and let me clarify for all of you, it is not climate change, it is global warming. The warming of the atmosphere, the warming of the oceans causes climate change. The climate change phrasing was created as a way of dodging around the fact that global warming had become a focal point of Republican resistance. And the belief was by changing the words that would somehow make it different. Ultimately, that didn't happen because rebranding almost anything doesn't work in the long term. So what we're talking about here is global warming. Global warming is absolutely and without a doubt, and there are 10,000 scientists and 10 trillion points of reference for data that show that it is actually happening and accelerating at a rate beyond what some of the worst scenarios suggested. Now, how do we address that? We address that by the things that cause climate change, and the principal cause of climate change is human activity that burns fossil fuels that put carbon in the air. Now, that's not the only thing. Methane goes in the air, and that's a greenhouse gas as well. But we have to transition to clean energy, and we have to do it much more rapidly than we have. And keep in mind, the United States stands alone on this issue. There is not another country in the world, not a communist country, not a dictatorship. No country disagrees that global warming is happening and that we need to act very quickly on it. It is only the United States, because of the stranglehold on the Republican side of the House, that continues to deny that global warming is happening, that climate change is real, and that we need to address it very, very quickly. I hope that hit both spots, both parts. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. McCall.
Thank you very much. I agree with Mr. Cooper, and I also believe that we have a choice. We can either have a green future or no future. We have got to make sure that we are investing in clean technology because humans currently are contributing heavily to global warming and climate change. You know, the oils that we're burning and the coal that we are burning were all once living creatures. And when those living creatures were fixing that carbon out of the atmosphere, it was a much hotter planet, one that we couldn't live on right now comfortably. In fact, if Miami was in that kind of condition right now, it would be underwater. And the scientists tell us that it will be soon. If we do not spend money now to save our climate, we will see catastrophes in our economy and our society. We will see refugees of the like that we didn't even see from Syria. We must act. This is a human rights issue. This is also a justice issue. The Syrian conflict itself began because of the worst drought in recorded human history, triggered by global climate change. Every decade's getting warmer. What can we do? We have to be careful in how we send this message, because when we fought another threat in World War II, we harnessed that conflict to employ people, to get everybody in on the same team. And we must do that now. Speaking to people in the 9th District, global warming seems like a distant threat. we must let them know that fighting global warming means employing them in local climate-friendly jobs. We must link local employment and local jobs to the fight against global warming. And that would be part of the Green New Deal.
Thank you. For Mr. McCall, the next question is on foreign policy, and the question is this: what do you believe is the biggest foreign policy issue facing the United States, and what is your opinion on how the Congress should address that issue? The question is, what do you believe is the biggest foreign policy issue facing the United States, and what is your opinion on how the Congress should address that issue? Mr. McCall.
Well, this is a topic that I believe my conservative neighbors will agree with me on. Our government, the part that is overseas, the part that is constantly invading other countries and staying there for way too long, I believe that is our biggest foreign policy issue, and it's all under our control. We have spent more rebuilding Afghanistan than we spent rebuilding Europe after World War II, adjusted for inflation. There are $1 billion lost to the warlords of Afghanistan building ghost schools, which that's what they call them in Afghanistan, because there are no teachers in the building, no students in the building, but the building, and warlords walking away with the cash. We are spending way too much of our human capital and our treasure overseas. Our greatest foreign policy issue is our willingness to invade countries and bomb them at the drop of a hat, to stay there endlessly, and to not help our own citizens with that patriotism. What I would do is I would repeal the authorization of the use of military force. I would put the power of war back in Congress's hands so that individuals in representative situations have to stand up and be shown with their vote. No one person should be in charge of the most powerful military with nuclear weapons in the history of the world, especially Donald Trump. But I don't even believe that Barack Obama should have that kind of power. So we need to take back power. That's our biggest foreign policy issue, is our assumption that war is normal, that invasion and occupation is the norm. We must change our culture, and we must understand that the only reason to go to war, the only reason, is when another country attacks us. Otherwise, we should be a nation of peace. That would be the most peaceful solution to our current global problems.
Thank you. Mr. Cooper.
Thank you. This question troubles me because it's hard with so many threats to the world, not just to the United States, to the world, to pick just one and say, well, that's the most important. Because as most of you know, in your own lives, you multitask. While you're educating your children, you're also working a job. You may have hobbies and all of that. And it's the same for foreign policy, not that it's a hobby, but it's the same for foreign policy. In my view, the biggest issue will always be, until they are gone, nuclear weapons. That has to be, because in a moment of stupidity, we have Donald Trump. In a moment of stupidity, 100 million, 1 billion people could die. I think almost anything else that we could talk about in the foreign policy realm pales by the possibility of nuclear war. So in terms of what Congress can do, certainly looking at the War Powers Act again and doing something more with that is important. I think restarting the START Treaty to try to reduce the number of nuclear warheads between Russia, China, the US is important. I also think, and it's not as much fun to talk about, but restructuring the military around the realities of a 21st century battlefield. Some of that happens in cyberspace. Obviously, the election of 2016, the election mistake, accounts for that. So for me, there's not one thing, but probably 5 or 6. And global warming, by the way, is a foreign policy issue. It creates the context in which conflict occurs. And then we need to do something about it. And we should not withdraw from that. 190 countries We need to have a relationship with all of them and address dictatorship and everything across the spectrum from the end, which would be nuclear war, all the way to the beginning, which is negotiation and alliance. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. The next topic is bipartisanship. And the question is this: what is your opinion of the current political climate in Washington, D.C., and how would you as a congressman try to address that climate? The question is, what is your opinion on the current political climate in Washington, D.C., and how would you as a congressman try to address that climate? Mr. Cooper.
Thank you. I was actually thinking Josh was going to take it. I forgot the rules. One might think that bipartisanship in the Congress is completely dead, and I think and I hope for the purposes of my campaign that that's not true. A couple of the issues that I'm focusing on in my own campaign include things that I think are very attractive to the Republican side of the House. One of them, as a matter of fact, is term limits, which is, again, another way to help save democracy. Congress has a 19%-ish positive rating, and yet 90% of the congressmen, usually men, sometimes women, are reelected. And that disconnect reflects the power of incumbency. So that is a reach across the aisle kind of issue. Another issue is going to be my status as a veteran, because there's a lot of respect in the Congress. Even though the number of people in Congress who have served drops every year, the reality is it still has some meaning there. And so the issues of veterans is something that is an across the aisle kind of thing. Also, interestingly, small business is an issue that I think I can reach across the aisle on. The Georgia 9th is nothing but small businesses, essentially, and many of them are single proprietors, that kind of thing. And so Republicans are very much in the economic development mode, and I think that I can reach across the aisle on that. Also, I'm kind of hoping I can shame them into just being better citizens, and maybe they'll reach across the aisle for that, because they've done some horrible things in terms of the lack of health care, the lying to the American public about that, and other things. And so maybe I can create some bipartisanship just out of guilt. Anyway.
Thank you. Mr. McCall.
Thank you. Bipartisanship is a complicated issue because looking at my own party, I sometimes feel that I'm going to have to reach across the aisle to find them. People come to ask me in my room sometimes, how's the Democratic Party? And I always ask them, what's that? Because I've been so disappointed in my own party at their lack of message this past couple of years. I go to my local Democratic meetings, and everybody is very clear about what they want. It's a progressive program, a progressive plan that embraces all Americans, not just the wealthiest. And as separate as we might look if you watch the tabloid politics in Washington, if you look at the polls, Republicans and Democrats are a lot closer on issues than we might appear. CNN and Fox News make a lot of money off of turning it into a Jerry Springer show. But if I talk to my neighbors, I find real bipartisanship on things like not wanting to be in every country all the time, except for our own. We can't get enough of Afghanistan, but we can't get out of Puerto Rico fast enough. There are plenty of bipartisan things that we could pass if people were representing their constituents instead of the companies who pay them. And that is also, there's one issue where there is bipartisanship, and that is corruption. The Democrats and Republicans often get paid by the same people. And if you wonder why Nancy Pelosi will not back Medicare for all, you'll find out if you follow the money, because the money ends up being in the same pockets as the ones who reached into the Republicans' coat as well. So to get to bipartisanship, we have to represent the people and not the corporations. And to do that, my solution is a PAC tax. It would take very long to overturn Citizens United, which I would love to do, but quicker than that, Congress still has the power to tax these political action committees at 75%, because you do not get representation without taxation.
Thank you, Mr. McCall. The next topic is gun issues. And I want you to listen carefully to this question. As a resident of the 9th District of Georgia, what is your opinion of the current debate over gun policy, and what legislation, if any, do you believe should be adopted? We start with Mr. McCall.
This reminds me of my favorite poet. You guys are listening to an English major, so you knew you were going to hear some poetry tonight. But William Butler Yeats once wrote that we are living in times that look like the second coming. The best lack all conviction, and the worst are full of passionate intensity. But once again, if you look at our neighbors and ask them what they think about this issue, it sounds very different from what you hear in Washington. I've been very disappointed in hearing the Democrats who really don't know enough about guns. It really doesn't take that long to sit down and learn about guns before you talk about them. We could pass some very effective legislation tomorrow that would be bipartisan. 60% of all gun owners believe we should have a ban on assault-style rifles. And I agree with that. And here's how we should go about it. You have to write very specific language, and it's very tough because the NRA is looking for any loophole. We need to put a limit on rifles that have a certain muzzle velocity, which is what makes AR-15 so dangerous, which also have detachable magazines. Tell gun owners that the only thing you have to change that would save lives is that when you shoot your .223, you have to reload. That's it. That one change would have saved several lives at Parkland, and I don't think that anybody with moral reasoning can look at those parents and say, your child wasn't worth the inconvenience of reloading my .223. Second, we need to make child safety laws so that when someone goes to buy a firearm, they sign a legally binding document whether or not they have minors in the home. If they do, they must at the very minimum purchase a trigger lock and recognize that it is illegal to keep unsecured firearms around their children. And most importantly, we need strenuous universal background checks which include a flagging system so that unstable individuals who make terroristic threats immediately have their weapons confiscated. We do not need another Parkland at my kid's school or at your kid's school. But because of the fear of this topic, people in Congress have not done one thing to save our children, but they have done something to save the vice president at the NRA convention.
Thank you, Mr. McCall. Mr. Cooper, I didn't read that twice. Would you like me to read that again, or do you understand that question?
Why don't you read it again? Because I'm trying to drag this out as long as possible.
As a resident of the 9th District of Georgia, what is your opinion of the current debate over gun policy, and what legislation, if any, do you believe should be adopted?
Well, my current opinion about the debate is that it makes me very sad, because the debate shouldn't be happening. There are too many Americans who have died because of gun violence to actually have a debate. That debate is driven by a combination of the power of the NRA and the propaganda capacity of what I call Fox Not the News, which keeps too many people enraged about this, but in the wrong way. So there are a couple things here. First of all, in order to be successful in doing this, in order to be successful in addressing this, we have to begin by decoupling the Second Amendment to the discussion of gun privileges. The only right that occurs in those few 20 words is the right to be a part, for free, of the U.S. military. The Second Amendment was written at the end of the Revolution. The nation was bankrupt. It could not afford an army. And so somebody said, I've got an idea. Why don't we make everybody the army, pay them nothing, and tell them that when we need them, y'all just come running. That is the actual Second Amendment. You will not find a single word that says hunting, target practice, supplementing first responders, or anything like that. We need to talk about the Second Amendment as being a relic of the past. We now can afford a very big army. And we need to have the Congress get involved in fully defining the civilian privileges of guns, which means, just to remind you, when you hunt, you have a permit. That means it's regulated. It's not a right. It is something that's legislated. When you conceal carry, you have a permit. So guns are, in fact, for civilian use, guns should be regulated and legislated exactly as other functions within our country.
Thank you. Not under the rules, Mr. McCall. So we'll have some time at the end for you to speak to topics of your choice. The next topic is the prescription drug crisis currently faces the country. And the question is this, and we'll start with Mr. Cooper. What specific proposals do you believe should be considered to address the abuse of prescription drugs? What specific proposals do you believe should be considered to address the abuse of prescription drugs? Mr. Cooper.
When I think of prescription drugs, I think of my mother and how much she has struggled to get the drugs that she says that she needs to allow her to live a good life and not be sick all the time. So that's what I think of. I don't even usually think of what changes should be made because the whole structure of the pharmaceutical industry is so geared around profit, and I as an individual feel so powerless to do anything about that, I set that aside. Now as a person who's running for office, it's a little bit different. So I think we need federal legislation as a function of changing our health system to expand it to be universal health care. In the framework of doing that work, we need to look at the profit-making operation that creates the drugs, that does the R&D work, that produces them, distributes them, and all of that, and see where we can make changes that will reduce those costs. Now, we can look to other countries as well. We should. This is a thing that Americans have, as a culture, we have a difficult time with. We want to be the country that invents all the answers, and we don't like to look outside of our borders. But the reality is, Canada can tell us things. The European Union can tell us things. And so, as legislation fights its way against Republican resistance through the Congress to give us the universal health care that we deserve as a right, that is the point where we deal with the high cost of prescription drugs. And I'm not even going to run out my time because that's my answer.
Mr. McCall.
And just to clarify, the question is about prescription drug abuse?
Drug abuse.
Okay. We already know one thing that works, legalizing marijuana. We know that for sure works. Now, if a bill came in front of me to legalize recreational marijuana across the U.S., I would vote yes. But I believe the quicker way to get people relief who need medical help with cannabis is to make sure that people can go to a doctor, and that doctor has the latitude in his or her knowledge to be able to prescribe the appropriate medicine with the least amount of side effects. And often, that is medical marijuana. I believe that we should also make it possible that when they have this prescription, the individual should be able to grow up to 3 plants in their own home. Because this is a plant, after all, we can grow on our own property, which we use for our own body. And conservatives, I believe, are against big government. And I think there's no bigger government that can tell you what you can do on your own land with your own body. But furthermore, I think that we need to move against, we need to be very cautious about punishing people who are hooked on these drugs. And in a broader sense, we need to end the war on drugs because we are arresting victims. We are arresting people who should be patients. They should not be locked up in cages. We should be making sure they get medical help. So if people do get hooked on these prescription drugs, I think we need to make it readily available and through Medicare for All that they go into a treatment center. As soon as they want to come off of that, that will not make them choose between life and livelihood, which our current medical system forces us to choose between. And finally, I think that we need to go after these pharmaceutical companies who have told lies about how addictive opioids are. If a drug dealer on the street lies to one of our kids about crack, and he's in a poor neighborhood and he's black, he's going to be in jail. But if an executive does it in a suit, he gets promotions, and he probably gets to sit with Doug Collins at those nice steak dinners they all go to.
The next question will start with Mr. McCall, and you may get your chance for rebuttal here because the next question is on marijuana policy. So, the question is this, What role do you believe the federal government should have in the legality or illegality of marijuana?
Well, I remember a quote from a man named Ehrlichman who worked in the Nixon campaign, in the Nixon administration. And it's one of the least known quotes, but it should be one of the best known quotes. He said, "We could no longer make it illegal to be black or to be on the left when we won in the Nixon campaign. But we knew our enemies were the black activists and the hippies, so we started the drug war." We need to recognize our past and recognize that if we decriminalize the use of marijuana, which is one step to make sure that universities can actually research it and that it can be traded across state lines, we also need to recognize the injustice of putting people in cages for what will soon inevitably be legal. And we need to grant clemency to the people who are currently sitting in jail because of the same thing that Bill Clinton joked about doing, that George W. Bush wrote a memoir, a self-help book about a story of redemption. There are people today in jail who did less than they did. And in fact, Donald Trump is about to elect a man who admitted to spending thousands of dollars a month on a cocaine habit. We've got to end the war on drugs, and that starts with decriminalizing marijuana. But we also need to go move further than that and grant the permission to doctors to prescribe marijuana, to be able to tell young people, here are the risks, the possible side effects. But for many conditions, such as Crohn's disease, many conditions that cause seizures, medical marijuana is by far the safest, cheapest, most effective cure, and I can't believe we live in a state that calls itself pro-life that won't let doctors prescribe that medicine.
Mr. Cooper.
I'm actually going to ask you to read the question again, since with my last answer, I only answered part of your question.
Sure. What role do you believe the federal government should have in the legality or illegality of marijuana?
I've been in a lot of states, and it's always frustrating to me that one state says, in our state, only certain things can happen, and then in another state, other things can happen. That's a lot to keep track of, and it's too much to keep track of. So the federal government's role, particularly in this issue, because it does cross state lines, is that they should be the final decision. There should be national laws about this. It would save everybody a lot of heartache. The federal government should absolutely legalize medicinal marijuana throughout the nation. The evidence is overwhelming, as Josh did a great job in explaining. And I'm going to tell you folks the truth, I usually do. I have grave concerns about making recreational marijuana nationally available. I have grave concerns because I've seen the kinds of sufferings with other kinds of things like alcohol. And there's no doubt that marijuana itself can be, even when it isn't, it can be a gateway to other drugs, other addictions, and things like that. The reason I'm saying this, instead of simply being quiet about it, is to say this. In my 40 years of observing, all the way from the 60s, I was born in the 50s, through the 60s all the way through, it is inconceivable that we can walk back from where this culture is with its desire to use marijuana. So there is, in my view, literally no point in having the discussion anymore. Marijuana should be legalized because it does far more damage to our culture, certainly in terms of communities of color, and certainly in terms of incarceration. Far more damage than just making it legal. I would still caution folks that the government needs to look very carefully at what that does to our culture as a whole. But I think it has to be legal to save us from so much pain and struggle and suffering.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper.
Oh, it's going to come back to me, isn't it? So
Yes, Mr. Cooper will be the first to answer this question. And it is, the question is about Puerto Rico or other states or territories that incur natural disaster. What is your opinion of the U.S. role when states or territories such as Puerto Rico experience natural disasters, and how specifically do you feel about the current U.S. policy implementation in Puerto Rico? Mr. Cooper.
you're going to read it twice.
Okay. What is your opinion of the U.S. role when states or territories such as Puerto Rico experience natural disaster, and what is your opinion of the current government policy implementation in Puerto Rico?
So first of all, the second half of the question, the federal government doesn't have a policy. Donald Trump has a policy, and Donald's policy is racist. And so the federal government has a system for dealing with all of our natural disasters, of which obviously Puerto Rico is one of them. And under normal circumstances, Puerto Rico would have received the highest level of support, not the lowest level. That is a political decision, that is a racist decision, and it is wrong. So the federal role is you take care of your citizens. The people of Puerto Rico are American citizens. They have the right to the protection and assistance and support of the American government and the American people. Anything done by a president or a party to make Puerto Ricans separate or less or unimportant is fundamentally wrong, fundamentally un-American. Now, I can't do anything about this right now, but I certainly can do something about that if I'm in Congress. So I think I hit both sides of that question, and I'll just stop at that. Except to say, it really makes me mad every day.
Mr. McCall.
Thank you, Dave. That was an excellent job. Don't you guys love getting together with Democrats? I just had that thought, how much nicer it is to be at a debate with Democrats. You know, I have a feeling that we're going to hear from some Puerto Ricans in the upcoming election because there are tens of thousands who fled as refugees from their own country into another state of their country, and they're in Florida. And so I have a feeling we're going to hear what Puerto Ricans feel about Donald Trump's policy toward Puerto Rico. When there's a natural disaster, that is the greatest illustration of our patriotism. We hear people such as Ted Cruz talk about patriotism all day long. They say Democrats don't love our country. They only care about immigrants. Well, we saw what happened when there were hurricanes that hit in New Jersey and in Florida. And that's when Ted Cruz decided, no, those Americans on that side don't really matter that much. So he voted against relief. Doug Collins has also voted against relief packages for hurricane-devastated regions right here in America. And so I think that when a natural disaster strikes, whether it's a wildfire or a hurricane, we must not leave that place until it is back to its original function. We must completely restore it. It is of one piece with our ideas for health care. When we help other Americans, we help all of us. When we leave Miami and Texas and especially Puerto Rico behind, we are hurting everybody in America. And so I look forward to hearing the voices of those Puerto Ricans who have the right to vote, who travel to Florida, and I hope to God that Democrats grow a backbone between now and then and actually speak to them with one voice about a clear message to actually help these regions that need to be revived.
Thank you, Mr. McCall. The next question, and Mr. McCall will go first, deals with the Veterans Administration. What changes do you believe should be made to the current federal operation of the Department of Veterans Affairs? What changes do you feel should be made to the current federal operation of the Department of Veterans Affairs? Mr. McCall.
Well, the best thing to do, I believe, to pass legislation is first you have to listen to the communities that legislation affects. And I hate to keep coming back to the marijuana issue. It really does feel like sometimes we're in the 60s again, doesn't it? All these strikes, everybody's talking about marijuana. But there's also a group of veterans for medical cannabis who are pleading with the government. One of the best treatments for PTSD is cannabis oil. But of course, the government doesn't hear their cries. Of course, they use them as stage props whenever they want to get elected. But when it comes time to actually being patriotic and taking care of the troops, that costs money. And while Democrats may be known as the tax and spend party, we at least know that we have to actually pay for what we get, unlike the $1 trillion deficit we're running now. So I think that we need to better fund the Veterans Administration. One of the problems is that they don't have very good quality staff in some places and very long waiting lines. They need more staff. That's going to cost more money. If we can afford to invade Iraq and Afghanistan and spend the treasure of our future, we can very well afford treating those patients when they come back. Because I'm going to tell you, when we do achieve the policy of the normalization of peace again in this country, which I strive for, we are going to have a lot of wounded veterans who will struggle in this society. They're homeless, they're killing themselves, 22 people a day. This is an urgent emergency. This is not something we can wait for. More funding for the VA, and if there's too long of a line, give those people a card and make sure they can get free treatment anywhere where they live.
Thank you. Mr. Cooper?
I want to start by saying what perhaps seems like it's obvious, but the Veterans Administration has been a problem, a crisis, for decades. It has been a problem and a crisis under both parties, and each party says, well, we're going to fix this. And maybe in your own lives, you've had experiences where you've said to your kids, well, we're going to fix this, when you knew you really couldn't do anything about it. In the case of the Veterans Administration, it is one of the most intractable problems that we have. The structure of the organization, the staffing of the organization, the funding of the organization, and I've actually used the Veterans Administration. When I had a separation of one of my ligaments and my entire right side fell down, I went to the Veterans Administration. I was carted there off during a Reserve Army weekend. And their idea was, I think we should just cut off a part of the bone on the edge. And I said, I want a second opinion. And I got a second opinion, and I didn't have to have the bone cut off. Now, there are literally thousands of great surgeons or great doctors in the Veterans Administrations, peppered here and there. But to change or to fix the Veterans Administration is a problem that I've, again, never thought about because it is so intractable. Obviously, funding is a big thing, but also not being a political football is a big thing. So stepping outside of that for a moment in my 30 seconds left, I want to make another comment that's really less about the structure of the VA, but how we treat soldiers so that they can get their appropriate benefits in 15 seconds, which is we need to have a program that trains soldiers from basic training through 21 gun salute so that they know what their veterans benefits are and they can use them throughout the period and not, as in my case, being clueless about the benefits until you actually need them and then it is too late. This would also address homelessness.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper.
It's a natural thing, isn't it? You just go,
The next question as we end the question and answer portion of our time together, and you'll have another 4 minutes to speak to wrap this up after this question. But this was not on the list, but I think you'll find it a softball, as you said, Dave. But it's a real question I think many people would like to hear from both of you about. And here's the question for Mr. Cooper first. What have you most enjoyed about running for Congress in the 9th District, and what are some things you have learned about yourself during this process? What have you most enjoyed about running for Congress in the 9th District, and what are some things you have learned about yourself?
Well, I'd like to begin by thanking our esteemed moderator for giving such a nice ending question.
We promise not to mud wrestle. I hope one of you will get a chance to mud wrestle later on in the summer.
Yeah, that's going to be a thing. It really is. Actually, I'm so tickled by the question. Read the first half at least.
What have you most enjoyed about running for Congress in the 9th District, and what are some things you've learned about yourself?
I'm going to do the second half first. It is incredible. I'm a high school graduate. Actually, I have a master's degree, which I don't think I mentioned in the intro. It is stunning how much I don't know. And the questions come as I talk with people, as I go to Democratic county meetings, the questions come up. I'm like, oh, I never thought of that before. It has what I've learned in part is it has sensitized me to what I'm reading. So issues that before I would have dismissed because as I mentioned earlier, I have no control over those things, so why should I get wrapped around? Now I recognize that as a candidate, I'm responsible for those things. So part of the amazing part and the things that I've learned is how I've developed a sense of responsibility that I might not otherwise have had. I'm sure my parents would be thrilled. And then the best part really is, and this will sound like a cliche, deal with it, it's the people. I have met so many incredible people. They've had ideas, they've had challenges, they've challenged me, they've asked me questions, and it's fun. It's just fun. And I will finish, I don't know how much time I have left, but I will finish with this. When I before I declared myself as a candidate, I went to a League of Women Voters meeting, and I didn't declare that I was a candidate or anything like that. And the gentleman sitting next to me had been a county commissioner, and he made the blanket statement to folks, everyone should run for office once. And it's true. So I would encourage all of you to think about that. I realize I'm out of time, but definitely think about it. You will learn so much about yourself and about your entire world just by taking on that responsibility. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. Mr. McCall.
So the thing that I've most enjoyed has been spending a lot of time with my family, riding on mountain roads, very long mountain roads, learning all the details of what makes my 14-year-old car sick and how to handle those curves. And also, I've learned the graciousness and the support of people across the political spectrum. And I think the most astounding thing that I've learned is the wrong people are drawing our maps. Not just at a gerrymandering level, but our political map. Because when I talk to Republicans, conservatives, people who identify themselves in one tribe, and I say, don't you think that we should be able to pick our own doctor and just put all of our money into one common fund that goes straight from us to our doctor? They all say, that sounds like a good idea. Now, if you listen to CNN or Fox News, the ones who draw the maps, they try to tell us that's radical or far left or whatever. But you know, some of the most evil people in history have been the ones to draw the maps. The people who drew the maps in the Middle East and North Africa drew the maps for their wealth and their power. And the same maps are being drawn today to keep us divided and to make sure that we don't get the power that we deserve by right as Americans in a republic, in a nation of equals. We are more alike than our politicians lead us to believe. And that's the astounding thing that I've learned. When I've been braced for attacks and for vitriol, I have very often, more than I believed I would, heard graciousness and civility and really great ideas from people across our political map.
Thank you very much. Okay. We are a little ahead of schedule, thanks to you all following the rules, and I certainly appreciate that. I can promise you, from having a little experience, nobody ever said, I wish he had to talk just a little bit longer, you know. So we're going to close by 4-minute closing statements, which is your opportunity to tell these folks why they should vote for you. And I believe, Mr. McCall, you opened earlier, so we'll ask Mr. Cooper to use his 4 minutes to close, and then Mr. McCall will follow. So, Mr. Cooper.
This is the part, now that we've lulled him into a false sense of security, that we just blow through the time. I'm just going to keep talking. So the first thing for me to do is to thank you, and I mean that so sincerely. Again, thank you, Democrats, for being Democrats and for caring and loving your country so much that you would put up with the abuse that you take. I'm going to take part of my time to note that I brought something for you. If you have not already received this, this is an article that came out in a very recent Atlantic magazine from two people who are policy experts their whole life, rigorously nonpartisan, and who have stepped out of that role to say, by the way, this was the March 2018 issue, so it's as current as it can be, to say that Donald Trump and the Republican Party are existential, I'm going to repeat that again, existential threats to democracy in the United States. So the article is called Boycott the Republican Party, a very unfortunate title because it would mean that many people wouldn't read it, and everybody should. It's a very fast read. If you haven't received a copy at another meeting, I would recommend that you, I would say, please take a copy. On the very back page is just the reference to this book. If you are amazed and confused at how a country so well designed, with a government so well formed, could get to the point where we are today, this book, Democracy in Chains, a 2017 book award nominee or finalist by Nancy McLean. She's a Duke University historian. I wrote in the back of this just the name of the book, Democracy in Chains, her name. If you just go to Barnes & Noble or some other bookstore and read the introduction, you'll begin to see why we are where we are. So I'm taking up my 4 minutes to say you may not listen to me in 3 weeks. I will vote for Josh. He is a fine man. If Josh prevails in the final, then good, I will volunteer for him. I told him that on the first day I met him, and it's true. So in the 3 weeks that I have left, I'm going to continue to talk about my candidacy, what I can do, my skill set, my experience, my commitment to this nation that goes over 4 decades, pushes 5 decades at this point. But if you're not going to listen to me after that, I certainly want you to listen to what experts are saying about the grave risks to our nation. That is more important than my candidacy. So I don't know where I am in the time, but I thank you for letting me try to give you something that might be of future value to you. Josh, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, the moderator, and thank you, Dave, for coming tonight to debate. I want to close by talking about what my vision is that will actually bring us together. Because if you look at the way we are divided and how cleverly we are manipulated by the media, by adrenaline junkies on the talk shows, we seem so divided when we're our most dramatic. But I believe that in our greatest needs, that's where we will find our common ground. That's where we'll find our center. Because no matter who you are, what makes us human makes us equal. No person in this country, nobody should die because they're poor, and nobody should be poor because they're dying. My number one priority is to make sure that every person in this district has access to health care, to cure their pain of their bodies, to alleviate torment in their minds, and to treat their teeth so that they can go into that job interview in their schools and be confident. Nobody should have to choose between life and livelihood. That's my number one priority. And the reason I believe that I can get there as your 9th District representative is because I have spent my entire life here. People who go to vote for me across the aisle, who have always voted Republicans, many of them have come up to me and said, for the first time in my life, Josh, I will be voting for a Democrat. And that's not because I'm a great person. It's because they've worked with me. It takes time to build relationships. And I'm not any better than Mr. Cooper. I'm not any more intelligent than Mr. Cooper. He is a good man with great values. But I do believe that I'm the better candidate for this district because of the roots that I've grown here, because of the hard work that I've put in with my colleagues who will also be voting in this election, the lessons that I've taught in my Sunday school class across the road at First Baptist Church, the people who I worked for, Clarence and Ed Williams, one of whom is still living, who gave me my first ever job and taught me how to work like I never thought I could work, carrying bricks and block to 2 stonemasons in their 60s. Those people, if they are going to come across the aisle and vote for a Democrat, they have got to know you and trust you. And I'm not an especially great person or an especially smart person, but I have put in the time and the work in this district right here locally. And looking out at these faces, I see many of you who shared a very special moment with me that I want to look back on and remember for just a moment. After Charlottesville, we wondered who is going to stand up. Our president tried to equivocate and say both sides were the problem when there were Nazis marching against peaceful protesters. And I organized a rally right here in response to that hate group, the Nazis in Charlottesville. And many of you showed up there with me bravely, knowing the kind of district we live in. And I saw many Republicans at that same rally. And the only person who can win in this district is someone that they know and trust and who can meet them on their common ground. I believe that I would like to introduce a new sort of Judeo-Christian values to this district. When I say I believe in Judeo-Christian values, I mean it. When Jesus taught, love your neighbor as yourself, if I want health care, a job, and prosperity for my family, I must, by obligation, also wish that on my neighbor, my LGBT neighbor, my immigrant neighbor, my Muslim neighbor, my atheist neighbor, just as they are. I am obligated by my faith to love everybody as much as I love myself. And I mean it. And so I want people here to stop reading the Bible in GOP translation. The poor are losers, starve the weak. And I want to build our nation around compassion and cooperation. That's the only thing that will save our country.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that's fitting.
Dave Cooper and Josh McCall, thank you.